So I looked at your Twitter before this interview, and the first message that you pinned on your Twitter says open source, open data, and open finance. So I have to say, like, Nansen is not open source, obviously, and it's paid data. And, you know, obviously open finance is something we're all working towards. So like, what do you mean by that? What's that message about?
So many people don't know this, but actually the foundation of Nansen is actually open source. And so there's a project called Ethereum ETL, which my co-founder Evgeny created back in 2017-18. And it's actually how the two of us met, because I was trying to do exactly the same thing. I discovered his open source project on GitHub. I reached out and we started working together shortly after. So actually the ingestion of the blockchain data. So if you have an Ethereum node, for example, and you want to get that data into a database, that part is fully open source. And we've also worked with Google to make sure that these data sets are publicly available. And so that open source project is actually used to generate data that is available through BigQuery. But you could also, and BigQuery is like a product in Google Cloud, which allows you to query the data with SQL and so on. But you could also use the same open source project to create your own database, you know, on your own computer. So it is true that, you know, Nansen itself is proprietary and it's not open source, but we are also the main driver of Ethereum ETL, which is the biggest open source project for ingesting Ethereum data. So I don't think, you know, I don't think it's, first of all, it's not easy to find business models where kind of you have everything open source and you try to figure it out, especially if you don't have a token, right? So I think our take on it has been, we can have some part of our tech stack open source, but we still want to have a proprietary sort of offering on top of that we can monetize and that we can grow. And then that will actually help sustain the open source initiatives that we have.
Interesting. That's great. I didn't know you and the co-founders were kind of early Ethereum contributors.
Yeah, so it's its own project, right? It's called Ethereum ETL, and it has, I think it has something like 1,000 likes on GitHub. It's not a part of like the Ethereum core itself, but it's an independent project which allows you to read out the data from an Ethereum node into a relational database or into like CSV files and so on.
That's really interesting. I mean, so far I've seen kind of three types of businesses emerging from the kind of the really early Ethereum developers. One type is the like the Gitcoin and maybe Swarm, and you know, it starts off being nonprofit, or you can even think of kind of maybe Uniswap in that particular sense at the beginning, where it's meant to be open source and everybody benefit everybody, and eventually they'll find a business model probably through tokenization and win really big that way. And then there's the kind of more enterprise model. I would put a lot of the MetaMask and Truffle and that type of stuff within that category. It's built from day one to suit a very as in it's part of a wider corporate structure where everybody gets paid like a nice salary. And then you guys are kind of going on a path that's kind of between the two. You're not quite part of a kind of a larger corporate umbrella, right, but also not quite the kind of the Gitcoin kind of pathway, which is great, which means you're not under any pressure to tokenize, and you can focus on building the product.
Yeah, that's a great summary. So I've said this a few times before in other interviews, but the key thing for me is I want us to focus 100% on the product. And if you have a token, sadly, that means you have to allocate a lot of resources to making sure that token has utility, you know, it fits in with whatever offerings that you're creating as a product.
Yeah, of course.
And so by not having a token, at least not this early, we avoid all that, and we can focus 100% on building a world-class product, because that's like hard enough on its own, right, to do that.